Every year, New Year's Eve is supposed to be a time of celebration, resolutions, and hope for a brighter tomorrow. But for me, it became the night I barely escaped with my life and my sanity. It started innocently enough. I'd been invited to a cabin in the woods by a friend of a friend, one of those last-minute plans you agree to when your own calendar is empty. The cabin belonged to a guy named Will. I'd never met him before, but he was one of those outdoorsy types who seemed perfectly at home in the middle of nowhere. The drive up was uneventful, except for the snowstorm that rolled in out of nowhere, turning the winding road into a white-knuckled nightmare. By the time I arrived, the cabin's windows glowed warmly against the dark, icy forest. Inside, the party was in full swing. There were about a dozen people, laughing, drinking, and making the best of being snowed in. I recognized a few faces, but most were strangers. Still, the atmosphere was friendly, and the crackling fireplace made it feel cozy, despite the storm outside. At first, everything was fine. We played some board games, had a few drinks, and laughed at bad New Year's resolutions. Midnight was still hours away when someone suggested we tell ghost stories. A couple of people groaned, but Will, the host, grinned like he'd been waiting for this moment. "I've got a good one," he said, leaning forward. "This cabin, it's haunted." Everyone laughed, but Will held up his hands. "No, I'm serious. The guy who built this place disappeared, just vanished into thin air. Some people say he went crazy living out here alone, that the isolation got to him. Others think..." He lowered his voice for dramatic effect. "Others think something out here took him." Someone rolled their eyes. "Oh, come on." "What, like Bigfoot?" Will shook his head. "No, not Bigfoot. Something worse. They call it the Gray Wanderer. It's a local legend. They say it's not really alive, not really dead, just hungry. And it's drawn to places like this, places where the veil between worlds is thin." The room had grown quiet. Even though most of us didn't believe in ghosts, there was something about the way Will told the story that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But then someone laughed nervously, and the tension broke. The stories continued, and the night wore on. Around 11:30, I needed a break from the crowd. The heat from the fire and the press of bodies was stifling, so I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The storm had eased up, but the snow was thick on the ground, muffling every sound. The forest loomed dark and silent around the cabin. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe Will's story had gotten under my skin, but I decided to take a little walk. Just a few minutes, I told myself, just to clear my head. I left my phone inside to charge, thinking I wouldn't need it. The cold hit me immediately, biting through my gloves and scarf. My breath puffed in white clouds as I crunched through the snow, following no particular path. The cabin's lights faded behind me, and soon I was surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. That's when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. But there were no leaves, just snow and ice. I stopped, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Help me." It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My heart started to race. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and thin against the vastness of the forest. "Is someone out there?" No answer, just the whisper, "Help me." I should have gone back to the cabin. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run. But the voice, it sounded so human, so desperate. I couldn't just leave. I followed it, stumbling through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees closed in around me, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The voice grew louder, more urgent. "Help me, please." And then I saw it. A figure just ahead, half hidden by the shadows. It was slumped against a tree, its head bowed. "Hey!" I shouted, relief flooding through me. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The proportions were off. Its arms were too long, its legs too thin, and its skin was gray, like ash. I stopped dead in my tracks. The thing's head lifted, and I saw its face, or rather, the void where its face should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank expanse of gray. It stood up, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. The voice came again, but this time it was inside my head, loud and echoing. "Help me!" I turned and ran. The snow slowed me down, and I could hear it behind me, the crunch of its footsteps impossibly fast. The cabin was nowhere in sight. Panic surged through me as I tripped and fell, my hands plunging into the freezing snow. I scrambled to my feet, my legs burning with effort. And then silence. I stopped, chest heaving, and looked around. Nothing, just the endless trees and the oppressive darkness. I was about to keep running when I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading back the way I'd come. Only, they weren't mine. They were larger, misshapen, and they ended just a few feet away, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. Somehow, I found my way back to the cabin. The party was still going, the sound of laughter and music spilling out into the night. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. Everyone turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "What happened?" someone asked. I couldn't answer. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt? I just shook my head and collapsed onto the nearest chair. For the rest of the night, I stayed close to the fire, jumping at every creak and shadow. When morning came, the storm had passed, and we packed up to leave. As we loaded the cars, I glanced back at the forest. The snow was pristine, untouched, except for a single trail of footprints leading away into the trees. They weren't human. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even celebrate New Year's Eve anymore. Because every year, as the clock ticks closer to midnight, I hear it again. That voice, faint and distant. Help me. Horrifying. True New Year's Eve. Horror story. It was New Year's Eve and I was alone. Not by choice, of course. I had planned to meet friends at a bar downtown to celebrate, but life had a way of throwing curveballs at me lately. A nasty breakup just before the holidays, work stress, and then, just as I was about to leave the house, my car broke down. The last thing I needed was to spend the night isolated in my apartment, but that's exactly what happened. I had no intentions of making the evening a big deal. I figured I'd grab some takeout, binge a few shows, and be asleep before midnight, just to avoid the entire New Year's hullabaloo. Little did I know that the night would take a dark turn, one that I would never forget. The apartment was eerily quiet. It was one of those places where the air felt thick, like something was always lingering just out of view. I had moved in a couple of months ago, but hadn't gotten around to making it truly feel like home. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the hallway outside seemed to stretch on forever. Even when I tried to relax, there was always an unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only sound in the apartment. It was just past 10 p.m., and I thought about stepping out to grab a beer, but a strange sense of dread kept me planted in my seat. Something about this night didn't feel right, but I shrugged it off. It was just the isolation getting to me, I thought. Suddenly the doorbell rang. I froze. Who could it be? No one had plans with me, and I hadn't ordered anything. The buzz from the doorbell felt like a disruption of the silence that had settled so comfortably over the apartment. It rang again, more insistent this time. I stood up cautiously, my feet heavy as if they didn't want to move. My hand brushed against the light switch as I approached the door, but I hesitated before flicking it on. What if it was some kind of prank? Or worse, someone trying to scam me? With a quick breath, I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. But the longer I stared, the more the unease began to creep back. I could have sworn I saw something move at the edge of my vision, a dark shape in the corner. I opened the door just a crack, my heart pounding in my chest. No one stood there, but there, on the welcome mat, was a single black envelope. The edges were slightly frayed, and the paper itself was thick and cold to the touch, like something ancient. A chill ran down my spine as I bent to pick it up. I didn't think much about it at first. Maybe it was some kind of weird joke or a weird New Year's tradition I'd never heard of. But as soon as my fingers brushed the paper, I felt it. Something was wrong. The air around me felt heavier, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I tore open the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper. It was plain, no logos or markings, just a simple message typed in bold black letters. "You're not alone tonight." My throat went dry. I stepped back into the apartment, closing the door with trembling hands. I scanned the room, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows. My eyes darted around, but everything was exactly as it had been a minute ago. Still, quiet, unnervingly normal. I turned to lock the door, but before I could, the lights flickered. Once, twice before going completely dark. The power was out. I didn't panic, at least not immediately. I stumbled through the darkness, reaching for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The small beam of light illuminated the room, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. The flickering lights had already set my nerves on edge, but now I was beginning to feel like I wasn't alone. I moved to the windows and looked out. The streets were deserted. Not a single soul was in sight. Even the usual noise of traffic or distant voices was missing. The night felt too still, like everything had stopped just for me. I thought about calling someone, anyone, just to hear a voice on the other end. But the isolation was suffocating. I didn't even want to talk. I just wanted to know what the hell was going on. Then, the knocking began. It wasn't a soft knock, like someone casually asking to be let in. No, this was loud, demanding, rapid. It came from the window. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. My feet carried me to the window before my mind could process what was happening. The blinds were shut tight, but the knocking continued. I moved them aside just enough to peer outside. What I saw still haunts me. Standing in the courtyard below my apartment was a figure, shrouded in darkness, the outline barely distinguishable in the dim light of the street lamp. But it wasn't the figure that terrified me. It was the way it moved. It wasn't human. No person stood that still, that perfectly motionless. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head tilted in an odd angle. I couldn't make out any distinct features, just an overwhelming feeling of wrongness. It felt like something that had been torn from the fabric of reality, something that shouldn't exist in this world. The knocking came again, louder this time, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just at my window. It was all around the building. At each corner, at each window, there was someone or something knocking just outside of my reach. Each knock reverberated deep in my chest, like the sound of a heartbeat, heavy and relentless. The figure outside my window didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, it raised one long, spindly arm toward me. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't want to touch it. I was too afraid to move, to breathe. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen. The arm outside the window grew longer, stretching toward the glass. It scraped the surface with a chilling, grating sound like fingernails on chalkboard. Then, everything stopped. The knocking, the figure, the pounding in my chest. It all ceased. The apartment returned to its unnerving silence. I dared not breathe for a moment, too scared to even blink. I don't remember how I made it through the night. The lights flickered back on eventually, and the knocking ceased. But as I lay in bed, wide awake, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped whatever it was that had visited me. It was New Year's Eve, but when the clock struck midnight, all I could hear was the silence, and I knew I was not alone. I never thought I'd spend a New Year's Eve fighting for my life, but here I am, writing this, not sure if anyone will ever read it. It started innocently enough. My friend Jake had invited me to a cabin in the middle of nowhere to celebrate the new year. "It'll be great," he said. "Just us, a few friends, no distractions, no cell service, a real break from the world." I was hesitant at first. The thought of being so isolated was unsettling, but Jake was persuasive. The drive out was uneventful. Snow blanketed the forest, and the world felt quiet, almost serene. The cabin was charming, rustic, and tucked away in a clearing. There were 6 of us: me, Jake, his girlfriend Laura, her friend Emily, and 2 other guys, Matt and Chris. We unpacked, got a fire going, and started the evening with drinks and laughter. It felt perfect, for a while. As the night wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. By the time we started counting down to midnight, the atmosphere had shifted. The cabin creaked under the pressure of the storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I chalked it up to the alcohol and the eerie setting, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the dark windows. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the power went out. We laughed it off at first, using our phones for light while Jake went to check the fuse box. Minutes passed, and he didn't come back. I decided to follow him, thinking maybe he needed help. The fuse box was outside, on the far side of the cabin. When I stepped out into the storm, the cold hit me like a wall. Snow swirled around, and the only sound was the wind. "Jake," I called, my voice swallowed by the storm. No answer. I found the fuse box open, but Jake wasn't there. The snow was pristine, undisturbed by footprints leading away. Panic started to creep in. I ran back inside, my heart pounding. "Jake's gone," I said. The laughter stopped. Laura looked at me, her face pale. "What do you mean, gone?" "He's not out there. The snow. There aren't any tracks." The room fell silent. Then Matt spoke up. "He's probably messing with us. Jake's like that." But I knew Jake, and this wasn't like him. Something was wrong. We searched the cabin, inside and out, but there was no sign of him. Laura was sobbing by then, and the rest of us were on edge. That's when Emily noticed something. "The door," she said, pointing. The front door had deep scratches gouged into the wood. They hadn't been there earlier. "What the hell?" Chris muttered. "It's an animal," Matt said, trying to sound confident. But we all knew those marks weren't from any animal. We decided to stick together, barricading ourselves in the living room. The fire provided the only light, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made us jump. Then we heard it, a faint knocking at the window. Laura screamed, and we all turned to look. Something was out there, a dark shape barely visible through the frosted glass. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in. Matt grabbed the poker from the fireplace. "Stay here," he said, heading for the door before anyone could stop him. "Matt, don't!" I shouted, but he was already outside. We watched from the window as he approached the figure. The firelight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A glint of teeth, unnaturally long fingers. Matt swung the poker, but it never connected. The thing moved too fast, almost a blur. He screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever. And then he was gone. Just gone. The rest of us barricaded the door, piling furniture in front of it. Laura was inconsolable, and Chris kept muttering, "This isn't real. This can't be real." Hours passed, though it felt like days. The fire was dying, and the cold was creeping in. We tried to stay awake, but exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the cabin. I froze, my breath visible in the frigid air. The others were still asleep, and I didn't dare wake them. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving closer. I gripped the nearest object, a heavy log from the firewood pile, and waited. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. Then the door creaked open. It wasn't Jake. It wasn't Matt. It wasn't anything human. The thing was tall, its body twisted and wrong, like it had been stitched together from shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth curled into a grin that showed too many teeth. It stepped into the room, and I swung the log with all my strength. It hit, but the thing barely flinched. Instead, it turned to me, its grin widening. Then it whispered my name. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, screams, chaos, the cabin door bursting open and running into the snow. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back to the main road. A truck driver picked me up, but when I tried to explain what had happened, he just shook his head. The police found the cabin the next day. They said it was empty, but the place was destroyed, like something had torn through it. They never found the others. It's been weeks now, and I'm still trying to piece together what happened. I've started sleeping with the lights on, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every now and then, I hear that whisper. My name, soft and chilling, and I know it's not over. If you're reading this, please don't go to the woods on New Year's Eve. Whatever's out there, it's still waiting.